Welcome to the Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. On today's show, the Mets take a series that was shortened by a rainout. We go through the week that was, aka the ups and downs of a 500 baseball team. Christian Scott makes his debut. There's a six-man rotation on the way. As always, we go down on the farm, review and make new scoreboard predictions, and answer your mailbag questions. So subscribe to the Mets Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can catch the shows on SNY's YouTube channel if you want to watch them, or wherever you get your podcast. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. This spring, inspire boldness and bloom at the Cadillac Move-Up Sales event. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer and subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your pods. If you'd like to drop us a review, drop us a mailbag question with that review, and watch us on YouTube, where you can also leave your mailbag questions in the comments under the show as well. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo. And Joe, a little bit more of the same. The Mets, as we sit here and record this, we've been waiting all day for a game that ended up being rained out. We thought we'd have a little post-game pod on the way. They're 18-18, more 500 baseball. It feels like they're getting stretches of losses and wins rather than really ping-ponging losses and wins. But honestly, Joe, not much has changed. We will get to Christian Scott's debut, but not much has changed with our New York Mets right now.
I was ready to do a true post-game reaction show because, we always record this, in the middle of a Tuesday, and there's a game that night, and we're kind of reacting well after. But an instant reaction, I was waiting to, talk about the Mets shutting down St. Louis, and it's the Jose Quintana and Adrian Hauser game and just beating up Sonny Gray. I was ready to talk about it. But, yeah, Connor, like you said, it's a lot of streakiness with them, right? Where they'll look really rough for a few games, and then they'll have a couple games where things look good. And the timing of the show works out in that case, that the Mets are coming off two strong games in St. Louis. If we recorded this on Monday, we might be singing a little bit of a different tune.
Yeah, it feels like with the Mets, I think Lindor is coming around a little bit. Obviously, the flu game or flu stretch there, it feels like Lindor is just getting back to himself. He's driving the ball. Obviously, it was a horrendous slump for Pete Alonso. And then at the end of the St. Louis series, it feels like, hopefully this is the turning point for Pete as well. Nimmo with some big-time home runs. It feels like with the Mets, the issues are relatively easy to identify, right? The guys that are star everyday players or even above average everyday players need to perform to that level. And for the majority of the Mets season, when you really think about it, it's actually a surprise that they are 500, because for a majority of the season, that hasn't been the case. Things have been better for Lindor, but man, it was a horrible start for him. Alonso has not been Pete Alonso. Yes, he's hit home runs, but everything in between that's been problematic as well. JD Martinez has been fine, but we're waiting for JD Martinez to get his footing going. We know that's going to take a little while for the big hits, not just the singles. Jeff McNeil is not the Jeff McNeil of old. Brandon Nimmo has been fine. Not a lot of complaints there. They need Francisco Alvarez to get healthy. But the bottom line is, Joe, it feels like we're waiting for the lineup to find consistency, not just splashes of big-time offensive production that we know is underneath there somewhere with the power or really just the actual names they have in this lineup. But I think there are ups and downs of this team that are easy to identify that are not, hey, will they, won't they? That's the lineup, is will they, won't they? There are things that are concrete to me. Right now, Joe, this team has a big problem with runners on base and controlling runners on base. And I don't see that changing until Francisco Alvarez is back and the pitchers make a significant effort to control those runners on base. And you're seeing some of the frustrations pour over from the actual defense. We saw Lindor hitting his glove against second base, which is good. It's good for somebody to be vocal about that. On the flip side, a trend that you could feel pretty concrete about, and people might laugh as I say this coming off a week where Edwin Diaz blew a save, which feels like a shocker to us at this point. This bullpen's pretty good, Joe, and it's not a one-man bullpen. This bullpen has depth to it that the Mets can get through 7th, 8th, ninth innings. No closer is going to be perfect. Diaz is still really, really good. We saw him get back to form shortly after that blown save against the Rays. So we're seeing trends form. And I think at the end of the day, what it's going to come down to is how, one, the offense finding consistency, but two, what can or can't be done for the things that are concerning right now.
When you talk about the inability to throw out runners, like you said, it is partially on the catchers. Omar Narvaez does not have a good arm behind the plate. Tomas Nido does, and the pitchers aren't helping. And on Baseball Savant and StatCast, they have a measure that actually grades pitchers on being able to hold runners. And the Mets are by far worse than baseball in that. Like number 2 is Toronto, I believe. Like the Mets were minus 12 and Toronto was minus 6. And that's like the difference between the worst and the second worst. So I don't even know if Francisco Alvarez solves the problem. I just think it makes it a little better because he's taking, the playing time, whatever playing time Omar Narvaez gets, Alvarez will get some of those. So that should help. But I mean, Alvarez was on the team and they couldn't throw guys out either. So I think that's going to be a significant problem for this team for the whole season until proven otherwise. And I'd be interested to see if that's something that they're able to take into account as we look forward. Like I know we're in May, so we want to not get too ahead of ourselves. But as we look forward to potentially acquiring players at the trade deadline and into next offseason, are they going to start looking a little more seriously at this metric for pitchers and pursue pitchers that do a better job of holding runners? Because there's a lot of times that, if you just give away second base, major league teams on average are going to find a way to drive in those runs sometimes. So that's something that they absolutely need to work through. The bullpen on the positive side, as you point out, Connor, it's a really good bullpen. Edwin Diaz obviously is getting his feet back under him, and he's doing, he's done a couple 2-inning outings and he's done some back-to-backs. So I really think better days are ahead for Edwin Diaz, and it's not like he's been bad. He's just given up a couple. Yeah, he's just given up a couple home runs, and we're used to perfect Edwin Diaz essentially, which is what he was in 2022. The velocity I think will spike up as the weather gets warmer and he gets just more comfortable, in his legs that coming back there. And Reed Garrett, obviously, we've talked about him on this show. He's what a revelation, just genuinely one of the best relievers in the sport right now. And being down Brooks Raley and Drew Smith, obviously significant losses, haven't really noticed, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but it would have been great to have Brooks Raley and Drew Smith, but next man up, they've been ready to go. So the bullpen, deep, strong, and that's something that you and I said coming into the season. We thought the bullpen might actually end up being the strength of the team, and certainly through a month and 10 days or so, it has been.
Well, and to be fair, too, when you talk about, guys stepping up, somebody that we thought was a huge factor in this bullpen for better or for worse would be Jorge Lopez. And he's got a 2.04 ERA in 18 appearances, Joe.
He pitches like every day, it feels like.
Every day. And he's been insanely effective for the Mets. I mean, and the crazy thing with Lopez is he's not striking out guys at a high rate. I mean, 7.6 over 9. He's just finding ways to get out. So, which, to be fair, the nice thing is when you are finding ways to get outs through contact, sometimes your appearances could be a little quicker, which means you could pitch the next day. If you're not a reliever throwing 25 to 30 pitches, well, sometimes we can get you up for the next day. So, no doubt, the bullpen deserves its flowers. It's been a next man up mentality. What do you think of how Mendoza's currently handling this outfield? Harrison Bader's been pretty vocal, I think justifiably so. I think the Bader one's tricky for me because I think he's a guy that wants to play every day. And I think with him performance-wise this year, he deserves to play every day. But I will give the Mets a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. The story with Bader throughout his entire career is that he gets hurt every single year. And once again, I'm not Mendoza, I'm not the Mets, but I don't think the Mets are being careful with Bader playing time strictly because they want everybody to play. I think part of them are probably thinking to themselves, how do we have Harrison Bader healthy the entire year, even if that means we're going to be a little careful with how often we play him for long, long stretches. And Bader is a guy, he's a competitive athlete, understandably on the counter of that is saying, well, I'm performing. He's hitting 280 right now in a lineup that nobody really has a good batting average. It's hard to argue against his defense. I mean, he's one of the best defensive center fielders in the entire game. He probably wants to put those injury concerns to bed this year because he's going to be a free agent after this year, and he wants to, kind of prove the doubters wrong against that. But big picture, Joe, they've given DJ Stewart playing time recently. The reality is, in his last 5 games, DJ Stewart's 1 for 11. It's just not a consistent hitter. He's almost a 0 defensively. It feels like this is the time to figure out some of these outfield reps, but you can't be 500 or lurking around 500 forever. At some point, you got to put your foot on the gas, and the best players have to play.
Yeah, in ways they are probably trying to protect Bader from himself a little bit because, like you said, he's such a competitor and he's balls to the wall all the time. Everything he does, which is the reason he probably has had injury concerns because it's max effort at all times with him. So sometimes with players like that, you almost have to protect them from themselves, even if they don't want to hear it. And I do think largely what has stood out to me with Mendoza in some of his in-game decision making, like in the game against St. Louis, DJ Stewart started, Bader was on the bench, and Mendoza said how Bader vocally wasn't too happy with that. In the middle of the game, Mets have a lead, takes DJ Stewart out, puts Harrison Bader in. Lindor, when he had his day off, he started feeling better. Halfway through the game, he goes in. Pete Alonso has his day off. Halfway through the game, he goes in. So I think Mendoza, so far, obviously, we're talking about average results because 500 is the definition of average, but it feels like he's pushing the right buttons at the right time and knowing when to make a change in game. And while we've talked on this show previously over the last couple of years about you can't manage every game like it's game 7 of the World Series because you have to get through this long marathon of a season. He's shown a lot of aggression with pinch hitting and putting guys in spots late in game that it's like he's not exactly managing every game like it's game 7 of the World Series, but it doesn't feel like the Mets are doing throwaway lineups and throwaway games. He might give guys a day off or half a day off, but he's going to make moves in game to heighten the chances to win that day.
Yeah, he's a tactician, right? Like Mendoza doesn't, there's really no thing overlooked, right? Like no stone unturned. If he feels like I could put in a defensive replacement that gives us a 0.08% better chance to close out this game, he's going to do it. And that's an active manager. It's somebody that's very involved in the game. I think it's for people that were wondering when Stearns got here, what kind of manager he would hire, Mendoza's a modern day manager, right, Joe? Like somebody that really follows trends and uses his entire roster down to from the pitching to the lineup to the defensive replacements. A guy that old school managers for the most part, and this has helped them at times, but it also hurts them at times. They go by feel, and Mendoza goes by feel. He's not just all analytical approach, but they also go by, well, we're gonna let this ride out and see what happens. We're gonna let this guy figure it out. And Mendoza kind of seems to have the mindset of, no, we're gonna do whatever we can to win this game. And I think that's something that Mets fans, Joe, can really get behind because it's kind of different than what they're used to over the years.
You have to be agile as a manager nowadays. I think that's a good way to put it, where you do have to balance. You have to have feel. You can't just look at an iPad and manage a baseball game, but you can't ignore that information either. And I think Mendoza in the early going, and we're still a month in, I've been nothing but satisfied with basically all of his in-game decisions. The last, few managers that we've had, I feel like almost every day we could have really poked holes in some managerial decisions in game. I think everything Mendoza has done makes sense. Has it always worked? No, but that's the nature of human beings playing a sport against each other.
Right.
But I think largely his decision-making has made sense, and I've really appreciated the way he's handled the media pre-game and post-game. He's been able to intelligently describe his reasoning behind his decisions, and frankly, that's what you can ask for.
That's exactly right. You're looking for a process in place. And I think Mendoza has clear processes and he's very concise in his ways. And a really interesting process that's looming, Joe, is the potential of a six-man rotation. And a large part of that is because of the presence of Christian Scott, who, credit to you, Joe, months ago, you said when a lot of people were looking at, hey, who's going to be the next guy up in this system? Vassell kind of had this little bit of a lead, and you were like, look at the stuff with Christian Scott and look at the trajectory Christian Scott is on. Christian Scott makes his debut with the Mets. He's the first arm up this year from the system in terms of actual prospects at this point. I wouldn't consider Butto a prospect anymore. We've seen enough of him. We're kind of just waiting for him to round into form. Scott, in a classic case of him, Joe, has the shaky-ish start, works around it, and then is nails. And you see this command, throwing strikes, the strikeout ability, the high compete level. I mean, he gives them almost 7 innings. At the end of the day, I don't expect Christian Scott to be that kind of performance every time out. But, Joe, this guy has all the makings in terms of the command and the stuff and the compete level of hopefully a future number 2 or number 3 starter in this rotation for a long time.
I'll tell you what, Connor, he expects to do that every time out.
Right.
He is a confident young man out there. And, watching him make his debut, it's just, such a culmination of this whole development process that he went through. I mean, you go back to University of Florida, he was a sinker slider reliever that pitched in the middle innings. He wasn't their closer. He wasn't their setup man. He was almost like a middle reliever. And the Mets saw something with him and they completely converted kind of his repertoire. And he's someone that just was so willing to work with this player development team and with obviously the analytics team to figure out all this stuff. And you and I spoke to him in Port St. Lucie a little bit, and you could tell he really just gets like the little details of pitching. And what stood out was he throws strikes. We've talked about that a lot. He pounds the strike zone. And at times, which you saw a little bit in the first inning, sometimes he needs to throw slightly better strikes. And that's, when you're throwing strikes, they're going to swing. And if they're not good strikes, they're going to get hit. But he got his feet under him. I mean, I'm sure there's a ton of adrenaline and everything going through his veins, making his major league debut. But the biggest thing, and credit to Adam Wainwright, who I thought was fantastic on that broadcast.
Phenomenal, man. Phenomenal.
His Christian Scott's ability to throw strikes is what gets you to get guys to chase pitches off the zone. So he's throwing his sweeper and his gyro slider for strikes, throwing his fastball for strikes. That gets those crazy swing and misses. Like, I forget which batter it was with Tampa that swung at a sweeper that was like halfway in the left-handed batter's box, like nowhere even close to the plane, just waved at it. It's because he throws all of his pitches for strikes. It allows you to stretch the zone. If you don't throw strikes, guys are much less likely to chase. So, I mean, I'm just going to say it. Christian Scott is the goods. And I think he's just gotten better and better. And at this point, I've always called him like a mid-rotation starter. I'm not saying what he can be, but I'm done putting a cap on Christian Scott because I think, obviously he could get rocked in his next outing. We'll have a different discussion. But I think everything about him, makeup-wise, stuff-wise, command-wise, I think the sky is the limit for what he can be.
I mean, how can you not think that after just watching? If you're a Mets fan and that's the first time you got to watch him pitch, you're probably walking away and being like, wow, like this is what we've been waiting for from this system for far too long, where I don't want to say pitching has been an afterthought because that's not reasonable at all, but there's been a clear effort to develop pitching in a way that I think is more creative in this era right now. You went through the timeline, Joe, of Christian Scott, what he was at Florida compared to what he is now as a major league pitcher that looks like he has the right stuff. It's just a lot of fun watching someone like that, because if you're a Mets fan, I don't want to say, I'm going to say I hate to get too far ahead of ourselves here, Joe, but I'm also going to say I love to get too far ahead of ourselves here. If Christian Scott proves himself this year, even as a number 3, right, which that'd be amazing, it totally changes how the Mets go into the offseason. I mean, you're looking at your rotation and going, okay, Kodai Senga, Christian Scott, And yeah, we're going to go after pitching, but we feel like we actually have two cornerstone pieces in this rotation. And then, there's a lot of variables with Severino, Manaya, and Quintana because of the contract related situations. They were really, but you can go fill your rotation again with guys like that if you already have two cornerstones. And then you could actually spend on the offense, which we expect them to do. It just changes how you could prepare. Having a solidified top, like two of the three spots in the rotation just changes how you can function as a general manager, president of baseball ops. It's no pressure, Joe, on Christian Scott, right?
Yeah. Hey, I'll tell you, in talking to him and talking to people around him,
Built for it.
He's built for it. He's ready for it. I don't think he's going to be fazed by any of this.
All right, let's get back to the big league club. And Christian Scott's a part of the big league club, so it feels funny saying that. But the staples here. And this has been kind of a big talking point of the show because it has to be. Jeff McNeil, and now I hate to say it, Pete Alonso kind of joins this fray. And it's weird because Pete is coming off, a brief series in St. Louis where, obviously there was some production there. He hits the big home run in the one game that he started in. He has 3 RBIs. But the reality is, Joe, for the 2024 Mets, there's only so much Nimmo can do. Say Lindor gets really hot over the summer again. They get production out of Starling Marte. They get production out of JT Martinez. The Pete Alonso, Jeff McNeil duo, tandem, has got to be closer to themselves if this team is going anywhere. And with Pete right now, it's fascinating to me, Joe. He's a good place to start because honestly, what else is there to say with Jeff McNeil? We have the same Jeff McNeil conversation every single week. If Jeff McNeil is going to be a threat in the Mets lineup, he needs to be hitting closer to 280, 300 because Jeff McNeil's not hitting 25 home runs. And right now, Jeff McNeil has a 644 OPS. He's not getting on base a ton. He's got a 248 batting average. He doesn't hit home runs. He doesn't steal bases. It's the same conversation with Jeff McNeil, and until that changes, conversation doesn't change at all. With Pete Alonso, I'm not hitting the alarm on this, Joe, but I do get a sense from the fan base that people, and they're right to ask this question. Are you worried at all, Joe, that Pete is kind of now leaning into an all or nothing player? You look at when he came up that year, he hit 260 in his next, and he had 941 OPS, 358 on base. His next full season, 2021, of course, because we're not counting the COVID year, 262, 344 on base. And then you look at 2022, 271, 352 on base. Last year, Joe, 217 batting average, 318 on base. This year so far, 212 batting average, 297 on base. We are starting to get to a place where we can't just always use streakiness and slumps as an excuse right now, where the reality is, and Pete Alonso hit 46 home runs last year, right? Pete Alonso will hit over 40 home runs this year. He's already got 9 and hasn't been that long. He'll hit over 40 this year. Is there any fear, Joe, that as Pete gets closer to 30, that he is not the well-rounded offensive player he was earlier in his career?
Very distinct possibility that's the case. And when you look at this year as well, off the field too, you have to think about, we always talk about walk years, right? And so often walk year stuff is just like, oh, it's his walk year, so he's going to have the best year of his career. And then he's going to go and he's going to cash in. And it works that way sometimes. And other times, sometimes you put a little too much pressure on yourself.
Sometimes you're Luis Severino.
Yes. So I think that I think there is probably some of that because you see Pete pressing that, which is not normal for him. Like last year wasn't a great year by Pete Alonso measures, but I never watched him last year and felt like, man, Pete is really pressing up there. It just felt like it just wasn't working out. Looks like he's pressing at the plate. He's chasing more than I'm used to seeing him chase. Like I know he strikes out, and that comes to the territory of a 40 home run guy, and you live with that. But if he's going to be somebody that is a bat in the 2 teens, 220, and get on base around the 300 clip, the 40 home runs are great, but they're not nearly as valuable at that point. So I think Pete Alonso needs to back to what worked. He's a strong guy that he doesn't have to try to put the ball over the fence. He just needs to hit the ball and it'll go over the fence. So, hopefully the way the St. Louis series ended, where things looked a little normal, he roped that homer, crushed that double into the right center field gap, looked much more like Pete Alonso. And, obviously I'm going off 2 at-bats instead of like a month-long sample size, but it all has to start somewhere. And they need Pete Alonso to get going in order for this team to get to the point where, we're talking about bouncing around the 500, which is fine for now. You want to get Senga back. You want to get some of these guys back from the injured list, Alvarez. So you want to hold fort until they do. But what you said a few minutes ago, Connor, is exactly it. At some point, you have to step on the gas if you want to be a contender. And if the Mets want to be a contender this year, I don't see a pathway to doing it without Pete Alonso being Pete Alonso.
And I think that's why you and I, when we would talk ourselves into reasons why the Mets can be in the playoff hunt, is Pete having a potential career year would be right in the middle of that. Now the Mets are at 500 and Pete's not even close to having a career year. So it leaves you, Joe, with the classic, well, if he turns this thing around, the Mets are going to be playing above 500 baseball. If he doesn't, the Mets aren't going anywhere. So it is a really odd place to be in. And I think getting away from the Mets perspective of it, right, that entire just outlook of how it affects the team right now and going forward, but part of it going forward individually to Pete is, understandably, Pete Alonso probably wants to reset the first base market. If Pete Alonso repeats close to 2023, so he hit 46 home runs, we'll say he hits 42 this year, but the batting average is still below 220. The on base is still below 320. The OPS is hovering a little over 800. Yeah, teams do crazy things in free agency, but a 30-year-old first baseman that you want to reset a market completely change what the annual average is for the top player at that, it's going to be tough sledding. So I'm fascinated by this one. Go ahead, Joe.
Unless he's ready to do a shorter deal. I don't know. Like, it's tough.
Teams have gotten smart.
Yeah, it's tough to envision a right-handed first baseman having a 2-year run leading into free agency that Pete potentially could have. Obviously we could have this conversation in 2 months and Pete Alonso is kind of much more back to normal. But in a world that it's similar to last year, you're going to be hard pressed to find a team that's going to be like, here's 7 years and, the highest AAV. Maybe he could hit the highest AAV if he's willing to take 4 years or something along those lines. But, we're a long ways from his free agency, but where we stand today, it at least the fact that we're having the conversation, as I would like to call us 2 rational guys, shows that Pete Alonso is obviously not performing to, just his standard. That's it. We're not expecting him to have a career year. We're expecting him to perform to his standard.
Right, exactly that. So we'll be all over that going forward. A lot of baseball left for Pete Alonso, and hopefully Jeff McNeil really can't. We've seen McNeil be a second half player before, and the Mets
last year he had a good second half.
Right, the Mets are going to need that from Jeff McNeil. You're listening to the Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcast. All right, Joe, let's go down on the farm. Blade Tidwell. Before we get to Tidwell, though, actually, we'll hold off. I got a little teaser coming in a bit, but I want to cover Tidwell here, Joe, because it's really been a very pitching heavy down on the farm year for us. We've talked about Cowboy Ohtani, who does a little bit of both. Talked about Jonah Tong. Christian Scott is here, and quite the arrival. But how about Blade Tidwell so far, Joe?
I mean, Blade Tidwell has been money so far this year. He had his best start of the year in his last outing. He threw 8 innings. He was efficient on his pitches, and I had my tweet up, and now I have to pull it back up because I had the box score handy. So welcome to live podcasting. But anyway, Blade Tidwell's been fantastic, and he's at a 1.23 ERA on the season. When he got called up to Double-A last year, he gave up his walk rate was a little high. He gave up some hits, still missed bats. But if you look at just those 3 measures from when he was in Double-A last year to when he's in Double-A now, he's giving up less hits He's yet to give up a home run this year. He's walking more than 2 batters per 9 less than he did last year in Double-A, and his strikeouts are up. Just efficiency is big. So here we go. 8 innings, 5 hits, no runs, 2 walks, 9 strikeouts, and he got through 8 innings on 94 pitches.
That's efficient.
He threw 72 strikes, which is a 76.5% strike rate, which is not something that I would have expected from Blade Tidwell a year ago. So what this shows to me is just where this pitching development system is at, where I know you mentioned that's been a pitching rich down in the farm. It's because the pitching in the system has been fantastic. At every level, there's somebody to talk about. And it's been quite some time since it's been that way. As far as pitching goes, it'd always be like, man, go watch Binghamton. They got 3 guys. Or go watch St. Lucie. They got 2 guys. Now it's watch Syracuse. They got Dom Hamlin. Mike Vassell struggled, but still a regarded prospect. Watch Binghamton. They have Blade Tidwell and Tylor Stewart. Watch Brooklyn. They got Brandon Sproat, Cowboy Ohtani, Jonah Tong now in that rotation. Go down to St. Lucie. You got Cade Morris from the draft last year. So like there's I wouldn't say building a pitching factory because that sounds a little extreme, but man, the way the Mets pitching is developing in this system is unlike I've seen in quite a few years. And Blade Tidwell is a guy that I think he expected to start the season in AAA. And when he repeated Double-A, it almost feels like chip on his shoulder kind of thing. And I suspect he's going to find his way to AAA Syracuse in the not too distant future. But Blade Tidwell, top 10 prospect in the system for me. Number 2 arm behind Christian Scott. So once Christian Scott graduates, Blade Tidwell will regain the throne as a top pitching prospect in my system. And I'll tell you, he's been fantastic this year.
And Joe, you brought up, of course, Jonah Tong, who recently got promoted to Brooklyn from Port St. Lucie. Joe, you sat down with him for an exclusive interview that is part of a feature on Tong, now on SNY.TV. Definitely go check that out for more down on the farm. All right, let's review our scoreboard predictions from last week. Reminder, since we're recording a little bit later this week than we normally do, these were based on games through Monday night, Tuesday not included. So the over-under push was set at 2 for Pete Alonso home runs. Joe, it was at 2. Joe, you pushed. I went over. He didn't hit any in our span for the scoreboard, so no points there. Over-under push was at 3 for Tomas Nido starts. We both went over. He started 4 games, just like we said, Joe. We each get a point. Over-under push was at 5 for Brandon Nimmo walks. We both went under. He had 3. We both got a point. Over-under push was set at 2 for Mets starters going at least 6 innings. Of course, we both pushed because that's always a 2 marker. They went over 3 starters, thanks to Christian Scott in the mix as well, being a part of that over 6 innings. No points awarded. Over-under push was set at 4 for Mets wins. We both pushed. They won 3. The under hits. No points awarded. A tie for us, Joe. 2-2 on the week. You lead the season series 13-10. So for this week, a little different. The Mets are off tomorrow, and we're recording next week's show on Monday. So you're going to get a little quick turnaround action from the Mets pod. This round will be focused on just Mets Braves. This is a perfect time to get involved if you want to do the scoreboard with us, because it's only a 3-game series this weekend at Citi Field. It's like a mini wild card round of the scoreboard. It's early in-season tournament for us, so everybody get involved in this one. The over-under push is set at 1, Joe, for Pete Alonso home runs in only 3 games.
I'll push. I think he'll hit a homer. I'm not ready to say he'll hit 2, but for all I know, he'll hit 4. It's you never know when Pete Alonso gets that power stroke going. It can be homers in bunches.
Yeah, and Alonso, 14 career home runs against the Braves. Alonso typically performs pretty well against division opponents for the Mets, so I'm going to push there as well. I think he gets a home run across the 3 games. Over-under pushes at 5 for Christian Scott strikeouts, Joe. I think I'm going to take the over here. I think Scott, there's going to be some hard contact against Scott, but like you said, Joe, he is going to throw strikes. He's going to attack hitters. I think he can get to 6 or 7 in this one. What do you got?
Over. I'm riding Christian Scott. I think I'm excited to see him against the Atlanta lineup because all I hear about him is how fearless he is. We're about to really see how fearless he is facing that lineup.
Yeah, I think the number's fair because of the lineup he's facing. He's coming off a debut where he had 6 strikeouts, but as you said, Joe, the Braves lineup will be a little bit of a different test. Over under pushes at 2 for Travis d'Arnaud RBIs. Joe, what do you got?
Man, this feels like an over. Travis d'Arnaud just loves to face the Mets. He has openly said that. Feels like he's going to have some walk-off 2-run double, and then he'll drive in a run in another game. So I'll go over on the d'Arnaud RBIs.
Yeah, it's nice he loves to face the Mets. I wish he loved to actually suit up for the Mets when he was here. That would have been good. So over under pushes at 2. Joe, you went over. I will go under. We'll see. d'Arnaud will probably play 2 of those 3 games, though, so he's got a good chance. Maybe the Mets can finally neutralize Travis d'Arnaud in a Braves uniform. Truly ridiculous. But credit to him. He's turned his career around and had quite a stretch for the Braves. Over under pushes at 1 for Mets catching someone stealing. Joe, I'm going under. I don't think they do it. What about you?
Under. I mean, you can't be throwing. I think they've thrown out like 3 guys all year or something like that. So it's hard to imagine, especially when you look at the Braves lineup where there's not a ton of stolen base threats, but Ronald Acuna is a guy that doesn't really get thrown out. So I'm going to go under. I don't think they're throwing anybody out.
All right, the Mets starters going at least 6 innings is now down to 1 because it's only a 3-game series. Like you said, Joe, brutal lineup against Atlanta. What do you like here?
And I believe I saw SNY post on Twitter. I think the pitching matchups are, I think it's Quintana, Scott, and Severino are the 3 games. So I'll push. I think one of them could go 6. And for bonus, I'm going to say Christian Scott's the one.
Oh, I like that. All right, I'll be a little different here, so we mix this up. I'll go over. I think the Mets two of the 3 starters can go 6 innings. It's going to be tough against Atlanta, but the Mets played Atlanta really well the one time they saw them this season, and I think they'll be up for the task at Citi Field. All right, Joe, over under push is at 1 for Mets wins. I will be the Joe character in this one and be a little optimistic and go over. I think the Mets can take 2 or 3 against Atlanta at Citi Field.
I think they can as well, but I will push, and I'll say the Mets will lose 2 out of 3 to Atlanta. Be a little different. We've been a little too similar on this scorecard. So, Atlanta also coming off kind of a little bit of a tougher stretch that they're going through. So it could be a turn it up weekend for Atlanta. So I'll say they take 2 out of 3, but I hope I'm wrong.
All right, let's close this thing out with some mailbag questions. As always, we are searching high and low for mailbag questions. You can leave them in the YouTube. If you want priority, you can leave them in an Apple Podcast review. This week, Joe, going straight from Twitter, old school right here. This one from Johnny. If you had to bet on one more of the top 10 prospects to make a big difference for the Mets by the end of the year, who would you go with? I'm assuming Johnny is factoring in that Christian Scott is here to stay, which I respect.
Yeah, I think Christian Scott is here to stay. It's an interesting one because my gut says Drew Gilbert because I thought he was going to be the first one up, but he's obviously been injured since around the middle of April, and I believe Anthony DeComo over at MLB.com reported that he should be back around the end of the month. So a long hamstring strain for Drew Gilbert. I'll go with him because I do think Harrison Bader, as good as it's been with him, I think as the season wears on, I think he'll kind of come back to life performance-wise, and Drew Gilbert is just a call away. I think the other option would probably have been Luis Angel Acuna, but he hasn't quite gotten his footing at the AAA level yet, and I'd really like to see him start to dominate that level before I start talking about him coming up and making impact, but it could be both of them, and I'll go Gilbert for the answer, though.
Yeah, it's hard right now to find a different player, right, Joe? I mean, when you look at, we've seen Christian Scott, Hamill and Vassell have not gotten off to hot starts, and the Mets.
Maybe
crazy.
Tidwell forces their hand, like if he gets called up to Syracuse and just continues on that trajectory. It would. I'll say this: it would not shock me if Blade Tidwell passed Mike Vassell on the depth chart.
He can pass both him and Hamill through the system.
I think Hamill is a little ahead of Vassell right now, so it might be tough. I think Tidwell's probably pushing it to take one of those rotation spots this year, but he is the way he looks. I really want to see him in AAA.
The good news for Hamill is, as much as the ERA is high, he's still striking out over 11 batters over 9, so it seems like the stuff is there for him.
It's just a couple bad outings, too, with
Right.
Hamill. It's not he just had a
Which
couple
in
rough ones.
AAA, we've seen a lot of that. Here's the issue, Joe. Like, you already highlighted this. In AAA, everybody's either hurt or underperforming, or in the top 2 levels. So Acuna is not having a good year offensively at all. So the answer is really only Drew Gilbert if he comes back, gets hot, and the Mets have an opening in the outfield. But other than that, I think it's going to be a little bit of a wait here for the next impact prospect. Okay, next one, of course, from our friend Clay Senator. He said, how about this one? We know that the starting pitching depth always works itself out. But if Megill comes off the IL soon and all current rotation arms are healthy, would you option him to AAA? I know that I'd prefer to keep Butto up here. I think he's earned that spot. What do you guys think?
So they'll have an interesting decision to make, I think, in regards to that. Having the options on Megill is helpful. I think Butto has earned the right to remain in the rotation. So I wouldn't be, bringing Megill into the rotation, then kicking Butto out. What's our 6? So we got Severino, Minaya, Quintana, Scott, Butto. Who else is in the 6? I'm missing someone obvious, aren't I?
I'm freezing on this as well.
Yeah.
No, because they're waiting for Senga to come back.
They're waiting for Senga.
And Hauser, you were thinking of Hauser initially.
Yes. Yeah.
It's
Hauser's in the bullpen for now.
So did they do... It's funny, we've heard so much 6-man rotation, and we just talked ourselves into we didn't even realize that doesn't exist right now.
Right.
So is that just the answer? Do you start that now with Megill, assuming that probably by the time Senga's back, one of the 6 will be hurt or struggling, right?
I think that makes the most sense. And the 6-man rotation thing, just to go on that conversation. So if Megill's ready after his next start in AAA, I think I would prefer him in the rotation over Hauser right now if you're going to do that 6-man rotation. And then when Senga comes back, you kind of figure it out from there. And, to Clay's point, maybe at that point you send Megill back to AAA to keep him stretched out as depth. But the 6-man rotation that the Mets are going through, I think in part right now, it's due to the stretch of games where they have barely any off days and they're playing 1 million baseball games in a row. So it's tough to kind of manage that. But I think big picture, it's perfect for where this Mets team is right now with Kodai Senga coming off the injury, with Christian Scott. We've talked about it on the show over the last week or so. There's only going to be so many innings he could throw this year. He's coming off 87 2/3 last year. It's tough to envision much more than 130 this year being able to get to. Otherwise, you're running the risk of potentially hurting the guy. So you don't want to do that. So I think the 6-man rotation, maybe not every single turn, but more turns than not for the rest of the season, I think makes sense to help Senga stay healthy, help you get Scott through more of the season instead of having to do some manipulation to send them down and kind of stop his innings count. And historically, most pitchers pitch better with an extra day of rest. So I think 6-man rotation makes sense for this team now. And I think it's something we've talked about on this show for a while, that I think this is where the game is headed. One day, a 6-man, we're going to be remember the days when you had a 5-man rotation? A 6-man rotation will become a normal thing at some point.
I'm with you all the way, especially the way the Mets are constructed. Think of it like this, and you highlighted a lot of this, Joe. Senga, the adjustment coming overseas, we knew that was always going to be, part of the plan for him. Minaya was a reliever much of last year. Then you have Scott, who has a clear innings limit, justifiably so. Really, the guys that it feels like can pitch until their arms fall off is Quintana. Butto, something about Butto tells me he can. I mean, Butto pretty much, credit to him, he goes
grinds
out there,
through 5-6 every time.
He's just got to prove that this is not an outlier and actually who he is. And then Severino with the laundry list of health problems. So the Mets are perfectly built to be a 6-man rotation because it starts to aid a lot of the risk that already exists in this rotation. You went out and got Severino on a 1-year deal because he has health issues, right? You went out and got Minaya on a 2-year deal, but it has the opt-out, which really makes it a 1-year deal in a sense, because he's not a consistent starter throughout his major league career. He's finding it with the Mets a little bit. So Yeah, the six-man rotation is obviously something that the Mets are very interested in, something we are big fans of as well. Our last mailbag question of today's show, Joe. This is from Forts McGorts. Do Alonso's increasingly long cold stretches give you pause for an extension? I'm a huge Pete fan, as all of us are. But if you look at 2019 and 2022, he was a lot more consistent from month to month than he's been in the last two seasons. It doesn't seem like a good trend. So we open the show with this a little bit, but I do think Forts McGorts makes a good point here. We're all gigantic Pete fans, and Pete is a staple of Mets baseball for the last half decade. And he's one of the best power hitters in the game. There's no denying that. This is going to be, and I think it's different than DeGrom, because I think Pete's free agency is going to be so much more simple than DeGrom's. Pete's is going to be, are you going to pay me? Are you going to match the highest offer? Because if you do, I want to be here. I want to be a Met. I want to be a lifelong Met. He's involved a lot here. He's loved here. It's going to be really as simple as that. With DeGrom, age was a factor. Injuries were a factor. We all kind of know it. If whatever you think, I personally think DeGrom did not want to be here anymore. It's all signs kind of point to that. That is his right, his choosing. It was just more convoluted of a free agency. But Joe, you have to classically weigh head and heart, right? Like the Mets are going to be running 1,000 analytical models to try to come down to a number of how Pete is going to age year after year into his 30s and what is a fair number that works with that, while also factoring in, Joe, this is where I bring up Hart, that he's one of the most loved Mets of the last 15 years.
We're about to find out how cold-blooded this front office and ownership group is. How much do they stick to those numbers? What is the unquantifiable value of face of the franchise type of player, everyone's favorite player? I can't tell you how many people I know. I have a couple friends that are like, can you just tell me Pete's going to stay? My 10-year-old son is freaking out about it. And it's
very
just like,
real. Yes.
Yeah. So like that is a factor that cannot be ignored in the New York market. You could pull that off in other cities, but you run the risk of alienating a portion of your fan base. With that said, there's always a number that makes everyone go, okay. You bring up the Jacob deGrom example. When he got 5 years at $40 million a year, even the Mets fans that wanted Jacob deGrom back were like, okay, totally get it. Can't do that. If Pete Alonso goes and he gets 8 or 9 years at record-setting money from somebody else and the Mets don't think it makes sense, then yeah, you might get some fans being upset, but I think some of them will see, the logic behind it. But if his market gets depressed a little bit because, as we talked about before, maybe he has a so-so walk year coming off a so-so year before, and he falls into like a 5 or 6 year deal at 25 a year, and Steve Cohen being the richest owner in the sport, and there's payroll flexibility and everything going in, it might be harder to convince people that was the right move. So while it's a little easy in the sense of do you want to pay him or do you not? I think there's a lot of factors that actually make Pete Alonso's free agency complicated for a front office and ownership group that is so forward thinking and thinking to the trends of where baseball is and where baseball is going, while also being able to balance. You have a chance to piss off a heck of a lot of people if you let Pete Alonso walk out the door for a reasonable contract.
These are all real talking points. And obviously, we bring this up because it's just not going away. Like on this show, we basically prioritize it like this. We talk about the Mets' actual baseball games. We talk about what's going on in the farm system, actual baseball games. But when we get to the mailbag, this is a topic that just will never end, Joe, and Mets fans care about it. So it seems wild to talk about the offseason in May, but everything Alonso does this year is under the microscope because of the pending offseason ahead of us. So it'll all sort itself out, but man, it is going to be fascinating. All right, Joe, give me some closing thoughts as the Mets head into pretty pivotal series. It's weird to say that in May, but if they take 2 out of 3 from Atlanta again, I think people will be like, okay, the Mets are inconsistent and they have flaws, but they are competing with their biggest rival in the division. And it does feel like some of their flaws are at least correctable over time.
Yeah, I think if they can pull off this series in Atlanta, it's huge. And then, of course, we'll be back with you before, that series starts. But then they have Phillies right after that. So right now, these are your two top competitors in division. And the Phillies are on an absolute roll right now. That they're playing like potentially the best team in baseball right now. They look fantastic. And the Braves are obviously so talented. And the Mets have had their share of troubles with Atlanta over the years. But I'm really looking forward to this weekend series, and I'll be there Sunday night for Mother's Day. It's pretty awesome when you have a mom who loves the Mets, where your Mother's Day present to her can be taking her to a Mets game, just like the win of wins as also being a big Mets fan. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to this series and seeing how the Mets stack themselves up, because at times, I think you said it on last week's show, Connor, it felt like they've been playing down to their competition. They played up to their competition when they were in Atlanta. So let's see if they can do that again this weekend.
This is the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. There are those who wait for spring, and then there are Cadillac drivers who boldly inspire its arrival, matching spring's exuberance with stunning performance and radiant style. So this spring, inspire boldness and bloom at the Cadillac Move Up Sales Event. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer. And remember to subscribe to the show at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review with a question, and we'll look for it for a future mailbag. And of course, you can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel, where we also take questions in the comment section there. Thanks so much, everybody. Catch you early next week.